question he gave for this moment of mission was, what is the Spirit doing in your congregation? And in fact, that's a question we've been asking ourselves almost incessantly the past several months. In September, we began a discernment process. For the last 2 years, we've been growing both in numbers, but also spiritually. And among many of us had emerged this sense that the Spirit was inviting us to go deeper with our journey with God, with each other, and with our ministry to our broken yet beautiful world, as our confession of faith says. And we wondered how we could cooperate with the stirring of the Spirit that seemed to be happening among us. So we decided to do this 7-month-long process of reflection and prayer and dialogue and creative visioning and decision-making. It was a really invigorating process, and sometimes we were just like, got sick of it too, frankly. But the Spirit worked through all of that. We were able to look back on 35 years of ministry in San Francisco, which we celebrated last fall as we began this process. We reflected on our current strengths and weaknesses, and then we just discerned possible futures to which we were being called. And here's what we came up with. And I'm going to talk about this in 3 main movements. So the first movement is movement toward God, movement toward the divine. Worship has always been a really important part of how we grow deeper into the divine love. And I think there's a level of authenticity and radical vulnerability, as someone put it in our church recently, in our worship that speaks very profoundly to some people. Sacred storytelling is a big part of what we do. We have members of our congregation are invited to share their faith stories, and they often are quite vulnerable, and it's a really community building and faith building exercise that we do together. But we wanted to go deeper. So we've come up with this idea of experiments in right relationship. This is a way of doing spiritual formation that is maybe more embodied and experiential. So people would get together, they would read scripture, and they would together discern what they think God is calling them to through that passage. And then that group would contract together basically to do a 6-week or so experiment in which they practice their faith in some very concrete way. So examples of that could be committing to a spiritual practice like Lectio Divina, which is a sacred reading of scripture that comes from the monastic tradition. It could look like living on a certain amount of money per day or week. It could look like, there was a group that did this here in which we got this idea. The group contracted to give away half of their possessions. And they sold half of their possessions and then gave the money to tsunami relief, the tsunami that happened back in 2004. We also came up with this idea of offering training, what we call training in the inner life. It would be a 9-month program where people partner to have a spiritual companion to support each other in discovering, exploring, and practicing spiritual disciplines like prayer, meditation, fasting, sacred reading of scripture, that sort of thing. And lastly, as we seek to do this, we're also trying to constantly incorporate our children and youth into this. When I started at this church in 2000, we had 6 kids and no regular Sunday school. And today we have 30 children and youth and 5 different Sunday school classes. So we've had a real baby boom. And we're constantly trying to figure out how we can bring our kids along into this process of spiritual formation and growing toward the divine that we are longing for. The second big movement is movement toward each other. We've always been a close-knit community. Many of us are not from the Bay Area, and our families are elsewhere. And so the church really becomes family to us. And as we've grown, this is one area where people probably experience the most discomfort. How are we known to each other? How are we seen and heard? How do we maintain and increase intimacy even when we don't know everybody in the church anymore? And when we hit a rough spot or a crisis, where do we turn for support when the pastor might not be as available as she used to be? Because there's so many more of us. So we've established and wanted to establish ever new what we're calling community-wide practices of care. How do we care for each other even more intentionally, although we already do that so organically? So we've done more support groups. We just started up a support group for people who have aging parents. We have a lot of people right now in the 40 to 50 age range who have parents who are getting into their 80s and 90s. Thank God that they are. We've got a clearness. We started using clearness committees more often. Clearness committee comes from the Quaker tradition. And it's basically one person who has a question about where the Spirit might be leading them, meets with a group of people who listen deeply to that person and then ask questions. And that's been a really fruitful process, a fruitful way to do group discernment. We have we've started an East Bay Supper Co-op, which is those of us who live in the East Bay meet together once a week for supper. And that's been a really wonderful way to increase our caring. Oh, excuse me, I thought that was my phone. And then the last thing we want to do in our movement toward each other is train each other ever more deeply in skills around active listening, around restorative justice as a personal practice. How do we actually really do restorative justice in our personal relationships? And also in group facilitation. The last movement is the movement outward. So MVS has always been a big part of who we are ever since the beginning. We formed around an MVS unit. MVS has really become an engine for us of doing young adult leadership training, because we just really throw our young adults and even our MVSers almost immediately into areas of church leadership and church participation. About 40% of our congregation is between the ages of 18 and 35. And my husband's a sociologist, and he tells me that's unusual in any congregation in the country today. So we've really embraced this, we've really embraced young adult leadership training as one of our missions. In addition, we have people who, I'd say we have a lot of what come to be called social entrepreneurs in our community. People who see a need, who feel a passion for it, and then go out to try to meet that need. We had a woman named Canary Webb who had, since she was 17, felt convicted by God to go to Indonesia and start a clinic in an underserved, a rural, completely medically underserved area there. And she linked that, she and her co-founder in Indonesia linked that with preservation of the rainforest. So they set up the clinic on the edge of a huge rainforest, and it linked, basically they provide free or very low-cost health care, and in return the people protect the rainforest and also do conservation measures like planting seedlings in places where there's been clear cutting. So we thought about how can we more intentionally nurture those sorts of social entrepreneurship passions that people have. So during our discernment process, we came up with something called the Social Impact Incubator. Now that's kind of a mouthful. What it really means is people with passions to do ministry in the world can come to a group of people with expertise in leadership and organization and business. And they can come and basically present like a business plan for a new ministry. That group will help them think through that plan, see if it's doable. We'll even provide some seed money for it. We'll help them make links with other organizations in the community that might already be doing that, and then give them the support they need as they nurture that idea. That proved that during our discernment, we tried to come up with one big thing that we could all do together as a congregation. And for a whole lot of reasons, lots of them geographic, since we're so flung all over the Bay Area, that was really hard to do. And we felt this was a way of getting, of really sending out a lot of seeds into the world, and then giving those people the support they need to really do that ministry. Some of the ideas that were brainstormed, and we'll see what happens to these seeds, are a Mennonite high school, a Peace and Justice school, a 10,000 Villages store, an Anabaptist Peace and Justice Center, a musicians outreach program, and a political action group around California education issues. So we'll see what happens. Now's the hard part. Now we need to actually move forward into this, this future that we feel God is calling us to. And we ask for your prayers, we covet them, because we know this is not something we do on our own, or we cannot do it. And so we know that unless God is intimately involved in this, this will not happen. And we know that your prayers will help us continue to be faithful as we listen to the Spirit as we move forward into this. So thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. That's inspirational. I know I always appreciate the benefit of taking time to intentionally pray and discern about next steps. So thank you.